Let's talk about light sources in Foundry VTT. If you join me for my walls section, you'll notice that our setup is a little different. I've added some walls down here. They're pretty roughshod, but they're only really there to demonstrate how lights interact with walls. So before we start interacting with the scene, you'll see that our observer can see everything in their line of sight. This is based on that unrestricted vision range setting, but we don't want that right now. What we want is for our observer to be limited by the darkness value of the scene. So let's switch that on. If we select our owl, you'll see that even though he can't actively see it, so he wouldn't be able to see any creatures in that area, that darkness is still obstructed. He cannot see creatures in there, but he can see the map because he's seen it before. If we want that to go away, we can reset the fog of war here. And then if we select our actor, we'll notice that he can only see this. And this is what a player would see with the current lighting settings of this map. Normally this token would have dark vision. We'll talk about dark vision and tokens emitting light in a little bit, but it's just that field here. You can reduce that or increase that as necessary for your player characters and creatures. Well, let's start putting some lights in the scene. Let's put a light in this building. And you'll notice that that light is bounded by these walls. They are ordinary walls. I have the display walls and all layers feature from DF Architect on right now. Let's put a light in this fountain. This fountain, as you can see, still has invisible walls. But the light doesn't care about invisible walls since it will wash through it. And if you'll notice, I dragged it slightly larger than those planters, and that light ends at those planters because of that terrain wall. If light tries to pass through two terrain walls, it is interrupted, just like token vision is. And let's put another light inside this building, which is itself made of terrain walls. You'll notice that it sort of occludes itself because of that wall layout. That is something to be mindful of when making walls, but in this case that's functioning as intended, so we're not worried about that. Let's go back and select our owl, and you'll notice what our owl can see. It can't see that light down in that building because it's blocked off by a true wall. It cannot see through that wall, and the light cannot go through the wall. It can see the light in the fountain because invisible walls do not block light. It can see the planters lit up as appropriate, and you'll notice that even though this is coming through different terrain walls than the light for the owl token, it is able to see inside because those are illuminated. So the token and the light source do not have to have continuous line of sight to each other. You notice that over here in this pocket too. You'll see the light source from this building is illuminating behind that planter, even though it can't see the wholeness of that source because it is trying to see through two terrain walls to see this portion here. But you can see here because if we look at the token, it is actually able to see around the bottom edge of that planter there. That is the important thing to know about lights. There are some other tools you can do on this light layer. You'll notice that I have the display light boundaries and all other layers that comes from DF Architect. If I turn that off and go to my token layer, those boundaries disappear. I'm going to leave that on because that's helpful. You can transition to daylight, which will change the darkness level of the scene. Now if we select our owl, as that crosses the darkness threshold, it should be able to see our scene again. You may have to reselect the token for that to happen. For players, sometimes they will need to refresh when that happens. And then back on the lighting layer, we can switch it back to darkness, and you'll see it gradually animate back. And once it reaches our darkness threshold, if we select our observer, again, you'll see that is restricted by the light. The other option here, we already reset the fog of wars, is the delete lights. If you click this clear lights button, it will delete all ambient lights from scene if you select yes. You will only really want to do this if perhaps you've imported a map with a lot of pre-built lights and it's causing your player's performance to decline. It is worth noting that lights are somewhat resource intensive with certain settings enabled. We'll talk about those in a second. And so if you have players who are constantly having issues disconnecting from the VTT or running out of memory or sluggish performance, it's probably because of the intensity of their lights. If you want to do something about that, you can have them go over to their game settings, go to configure settings, and I have a module on that shows which are per user and which are server settings, but particularly these settings here enable soft shadows, and light source animation, and sometimes token vision animation can impact performance. I don't think token vision animation is as big of a deal, but these two settings, enable soft shadows and light source animation, can definitely negatively impact performance, especially in scenes with a lot of animated lights. The fewer lights you have in a scene, the better it is for performance. So if you've imported a module with 4 lights in a room, and they're providing overlapping light, and they look really nice, but your players are crashing, you can clear all those lights and then just drag one light out instead. But let's talk a little bit about lights. I have, again, the DF Architect module, which allows me to just click this button to invert between areas of light and darkness. You'll notice that that changes that. I believe for the purpose of tokens that usually they can see inside darkness, which might be a mechanically undesirable effect, but it does enable certain types of animations to look better in that inverted vision. There are certain animations, some of them come from DF Architect, that are specifically built around having darkness, and so if you use those with light, they don't look quite the same. But let's switch that back to light and update that light source again. Before we talk into all this fancy light settings, let's go back to that token, because tokens can be light sources as well. Let's go over to Vision, and let's give our owl back its 120-foot dark vision, because I don't want to forget that after this tutorial, because I do use this as an observer in my sessions sometimes. And let's look at the other settings here. Just like a regular light, tokens have a dim light radius and a bright light radius. And so if we set this, our observer will be emitting light. So you'll see that it can see, let me move it down to this corner. So you can see that it can see 120 feet, but it's not emitting light. So it can see up in that corner. Actually, that might be its dark vision range. Yeah, let me fix that real quick. I had it set to dim vision and dim light. If I set it to bright light, you'll see the difference, because dim vision treats the area as if it was illuminated by dim light, bright light treats the area as if it was illuminated by bright light. Typos are fun. And you'll notice now the dark vision and the light are 2 different values. See that it's casting bright light. And if we had another token here, let's say another observer token, and you'll notice that this observer token does not inherit the light properties from that other. We'll talk about that a little bit when we get to tokens, but you'll notice that it can see the bright light from that other token, even if it's occluded. And then if we move that token, that light will move with it. Well, that token also has its own 120-foot dark vision range. But let's go back to this token and talk about something else real quick for a second. You've probably noticed this emission angle. If I wanted to change the light source of a token, I can do that. Now, this is actually different than you're doing that setting on the light. Lights have emission angles and emission radii. Tokens just have emission radii, or angles. I messed that up. We'll talk about that in a second when we get back to lights, but for now what you need to know is that tokens always emit light in the direction they are facing. So if I hold the shift arrow keys, if I hold shift and press arrow keys, it will rotate this token, and you'll see that it has a cone of light that follows it. That can be useful if you have, say, guards with patrol cones and you want to see what they can see. It can be useful if you have characters with a hooded lantern and you want to be able to see that they are facing in the right direction. Generally, in at least 5th edition D&D, that's not particularly relevant, but it can come up, especially if you have, say, some characters that like being in darkness because they have dark vision, and other characters that like being in light to draw threats or something like that. Having conical light can be helpful. Let's set that back up to 360. And let's actually turn that light off for now because we don't need it right now. Let's just head back to our fountain light. I have this light in the center of the fountain, and we can do that emission angle. Let's set it to 90 degrees just as a demo. And then there's the slight rotation angle. There's the slider you can drag with your mouse. You can also use the scroll wheel for precise dialing in. The slider is a little bit imprecise, so that trick is very useful. You cannot type in this box. So and if you don't have a scroll wheel, you can fiddle with that slider, or you can also use the left and right or up and down arrow keys to adjust that as well. Darkness activation range is a property of lights that basically says if the light is above a certain level, this light does not turn on. So let's set that, head back to our scene layer. configure our scene and set our light to 0.25. And you'll notice now if we select our observer, the observer does not have universal vision because that is set to be at a higher threshold. It does have dark vision, so I can see everything it has line of sight on because the scene is pretty small. But you will notice that that light is supposed to be disabled. It is still showing up for some reason. I think I may have screwed up that setting actually. Hold on. No, that should be... Hold on. Yeah, I forgot to hit update in the scene. I am running Foundry on a remote server, and sometimes things desynchronize, and that is what happened here. So you'll notice now that that light is properly off. Though I use very high vision limitation thresholds here. Usually we want that to be closer to maybe like a 0.6 where it starts to start looking dusky. But for the purposes of the tutorial, that's fine. And that can also be done just cosmetically. So you could even have this set to be at 0.3 so it clicks on before it gets dark. Let's set that to mission angle. Actually, let's set it to 180. And you'll see now that we can rotate that if we want to. And so you could have this, be here. Let's say we wanted to have two lights here. What we could do is we could select that light. Selecting lights is a little finicky. Let's copy paste that, Control-C, Control-V, and then I will select the second light. Oops, I did not save that, so reset, but that's fine. For our purposes, it doesn't need to be that way. We'll set this one. It's important to click Update on your lights. And we'll set that here, and set this one here. And there we have a light that is split around something. So if you had, say you have an invisible wall in the center there, and you want the light to be split, but you don't want to make an actual wall that players can't see through, you could use that to do so. Or if you have, say, two lanterns on the side of a tavern, you could have one casting light at a certain angle and the other at the other. Let's reset this back to 360. And then the rotation won't matter because it is a circle. Drag this back to the center. There are some other options for lights as well. You can set the color for a light. I'm going to use my color picker to select the red from one of these roses. Let's try, actually maybe that pinkish is better. You can change the color intensity, so you'll see that's very pink. This is more of just sort of a pale light. And then in the middle it's a little bit rosish. You can also manually set that color, so if I wanted it to be a neon blue light. And I can turn that color intensity up and down with the mouse wheel as well as the slider. High color intensities tend to make lights look brighter, especially if you picked a bright color for the light. So that can be one tool. And then of course if you take the intensity off, it's just illuminating the map below it. You can also animate your lights, and again, this is a performance hit, so if you have players on machines that have more difficulty running Foundry, you may want to be conservative with this setting. You can set it to torch, which is sort of pulsing light. Set it to pulse, which is sort of, it pulses in and out. I know I said torch is pulsing, but this is more of a regular pulse, whereas torch is a little bit random on its pulsing. Again, it's not as orderly. There's also Chroma, which is sort of, if you had like a rave or something, you could use that. Not particularly useful for most D&D settings, but if you're playing like a Shadowrun campaign, that would come up a lot. Pulsing Wave works well for certain types of magical effects. Or if you want to make like a magical bubble of force, you can use a light effect over a tile or over your map to make that look more alive. Swirling Fog is always a good one. I can always find a use for Swirling Fog. Magic, actual fog, just for fun. And Swirling Fog is a good place to show off some of our animation settings. You can change the speed of that animation. So if we set that to 10, that animation is really roiling. It's really, really excited. If we set it to 1, it's sort of ominous and looming and maybe appropriate for a spooky session. You can also change the intensity of the animation, which will make it seem much more vivid. That does also stack with color intensities, so you can burn your eyes out if you want to. And you can also turn that down so that it's more subtle. So if we want to have that be more subtle, we can set that, and you can see that it's still there if I turn up the color intensity, but if I set that color intensity down, you'll notice that it's just kind of unearthly. There's a bit of fog there, but it might take a moment for players to figure it out. And that's a good way to make your lights seem more dynamic without it being particularly distracting. Set those settings really low, and players will notice them, but they won't really put their finger on them, and so it doesn't feel quite as immersion breaking sometimes as some heavy-handed light effects might. Let's set those back. Sunburst is particularly garish in terms of being extremely bright because it is a sunburst, so you'll notice that even at the default speed and intensity settings, this is extremely bright. There's Light Dome, great for force fields, portals, stuff like that. You can change those animation speeds and intensities for all of these. Mysterious Emanation if you want to go retro sci-fi, Hexadome if you want some sort of force field, Ghostly Light, kind of a more spooky mist, Energy Field. There's a bunch of animations. You'll notice that these are designed to work with darkness, so that's this invert button that comes from DF Architect. You can also just type a negative value in there. You'll notice that that looks like a really good darkness effect, and the same with the black hole. So that can be useful narratively as well. And if you do the other light effects with darkness, they look a little bit funky. Like the sunbeam barely shows up, or sunburst, because of the way that lights work. If we switch that back to default, it is back to being blinding. But let's set this to swirling fog and set that intensity way down. And some of those things can also be applied to token lights. So you can set an animation to a token light as well. So if you had a creature with a force field up, you could set it to have, and you can set just a bright light radius for these two. If you don't want to have a dim light protruding out, you don't have to set the dim light radius up, but it will not be additive. So you set a 60-60, it will only be bright light. If you set a 60-120, you'll have 60 feet of bright, 120 feet of dim, which will be 60 feet beyond bright. But let's do a really powerful force field for this observer token. Grab that sample there. And you'll see now that it has that shimmering force field, which anti-aliases very badly if you're zoomed out. But and of course, if we don't want it to be quite that, we can always turn that down to lower the intensity and lower the speed. And different animations have different settings. Like you'll notice when we change the intensity and speed, the size of the hexagons changed. And that is more or less all you need to know about lights. Let's delete that token and delete these lights. And I will see you next time when we talk about drawings and tiles.